Hello and welcome to the Microsoft Virtual Academy session for Securing Privileged Access. My name is Mark Simos. I'm from the Enterprise Cybersecurity Group.
And I'm Jessica. I'm also from the Enterprise Cybersecurity Group.
And this is a roadmap on securing privileged access. This is one of the most important aspects of a cybersecurity defense and protecting against attackers that are targeting your environment and the data that is stored in it. All the information that we're covering here is also covered online in the aka.ms SPA roadmap link that you see there. And we encourage you to follow that, read through it, and follow this roadmap. These are the recommendations that are born of the cybersecurity team's experience as we've been investigating and responding to these attacks, as well as defending our customers against them.
That's a really key point, Mark, because this is actually based on the work that my team, the incident response team, does for learning what real attackers are doing. So these are defenses that are truly proven on what actual attackers are doing.
Enterprises today are really being driven by several different forces. One set of forces is driving them towards modern technology, cloud, big data, analytics, and all those associated pieces. And the other is the cybersecurity threats. And enterprises are really trying to get to the point where they're both a secure and a modern enterprise. And so when we look at what this end state is, there's a couple of different hallmarks. Overall, the business, the organization is going to be aligned to both the business objectives of the organization and what that mission, that business that it's trying to accomplish, as well as the current threat environment and what the attackers are doing and what they're targeting. And that's the overall piece. When you break it down into the different technology areas, identity, ultimately the high watermark of the identity pillar there, that's a component of it. Identity has really become the primary security perimeter. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go through it, but it's really displaced the network boundary as the primary security perimeter. Applications and data, it's really about identifying what is important to the business and aligning those security investments to protect those data, the communications, the applications that are most important to the business first, and allocating those resources in a useful way so that the security protections are protecting the most important things. Infrastructure, there's a lot of modernization going in both on premises and more importantly in the cloud to not only host much more secure infrastructure, but also to use that cloud to protect the infrastructure, whether it's hosted on-premise or in the cloud. There's a lot of capabilities that the power of the cloud and the intelligence that can be gained on it, the analytics and the processing power, the machine learning and the like that can bring to it. And then devices spaces, there's also a lot of innovation going on there, especially in the Windows 10 platform around hardware-backed assurances for credentials and for applications and the like. There's some great technology there, as well as some extremely good detection technology coming along with Windows Defender ATP. Where we're going to be focusing on today, though, is on the identity pillar. And really, when you look at the identity pillar, there's really two different types of initiatives to be driving in that space. One is the privileged access, which is what we're going to be talking about today, which includes the identity systems and the administrators of them. And then the other is the identities overall in general, including all of the users and all of the devices and all the identities, including the devices that they use them on. And so we're going to be focusing on that privileged access today. So some of the challenges that we see in the space is really identity is critical to all of security. You can't make a sentence or a statement or an aspiration. You can't ask a question about security without using an identity in a sentence. I want to keep X users out of Y resources. I only want A to be able to access B. You have to use an identity to even have a semblance of a security plan or an assurance. And so identity is a really critical security asset. And attackers know that, and they're going after them. They're stealing identities, both individual user identities as well as administrative identities, and they're targeting those very, very intently.
I think that some of the recent news you might have seen, there's been a lot of websites that I steal identities from. So if you can steal a password for one system, you can see through password resource reuse that they've been getting access to other systems. But it's really about who you are and what data you have access to. Because if I can target an individual who has access to the insider trading information of a company, I only need to steal their access. I don't even need to do a lot of work. So absolutely, identity is the target.
Yep. And one of the trickiest parts about the identity attacks is tracking them is actually quite challenging, because when you look at an event for a stolen identity, it looks like an event that was done by the legitimate user. And so it becomes very difficult to tell the difference between those if you don't have some way to differentiate between that legitimate access and an attacker performing illegitimate actions. So we're going to be focusing on that securing privileged access piece of this modern enterprise. And when we take a look across what a modern enterprise is, it's really a complex thing. You've got everything from your traditional servers as well as workstations. You've got branch offices, of course, remote PCs. You've got to deal with customer and partner access, and how do you manage that? You've got third-party SaaS. Many organizations actually don't have a good understanding of what applications are being used by their users, and may be surprised that their users are already using various third-party SaaS services for storage and for collaboration because IT may not have been moving fast enough for them, and so they have unauthorized usage of these cloud apps. You talk about authorized applications in the cloud. Talk about IaaS that's either authorized or not on third parties on the Microsoft platform. Got high-value assets mixed in with the standard assets. It's a very complex thing, and so securing this modern environment is quite a challenge. And when you look at the traditional security boundary was typically drawn around the network, but when you think about it, the assets through through users using third-party SaaSes or really any kind of software as a service, the data has left the perimeter, whether the organization is authorized it or not in many cases. And at the same time, the attackers have also been very successful at entering the perimeter and getting inside of this traditional network perimeter.
And that's a big mind shift from, I think, a lot of people think. A lot of people think I have a perimeter firewall. An attacker these days isn't going to spend a lot of time banging against your firewall, doing port scans. A lot of people have this concept of, if I close that port, I'll be fine. Because that's not really how an attacker gets into a system nowadays. Nowadays, what we see is one small administrator mistake is what leads to the attack. Because if I've got an administrator and they've made a mistake, such as maybe they're browsing on the same website or same laptop that they use to do administrative activities, they browse to a website and malware can be embedded in there. We see a lot of times recently that malware is getting embedded into legitimate websites. And once that malware executes, they can steal those credentials, the credentials of that administrator. And once they have that, if I've got administrative access, it's anything I want to do, I can do. So whether that be local administrator or domain administrator, I can use that to move about the network, get data, disrupt your business. There's even some very interesting targeted attacks going on now where there's this thing called cyber extortion, where they use that privileged access to gain access to data and then essentially held the enterprise hostage. So once I get those pieces of credentials, so I've got access. So usually within the first 24 to 48 hours, I can establish a beachhead in your network. It might be a phishing attempt. It might be a really well-crafted email. It might be something that simply says enable macros, which allows the attacker to then run commands on that computer. If that user is running as a local admin right there, he's already got access. He doesn't need to use any vulnerability, but he could also use a vulnerability in software to gain administrative access. Once he has that, he can harvest the credentials off that first machine, something like a shared local administrator password or maybe the password of a help desk, and then he can use it to move laterally to the next system on the network. And he can use that to gain administrative access in many ways, because if he can move laterally amongst desktops and the domain or server admins are sharing desktops that the same workstation administrators have access to, he's got access to those as well. He could, of course, once he's inside the network, take advantage of something like an unpatched server to move about the network as well. But that's far less common these days.
Yep.
Yeah. So once he's got that, he can go until he gets domain admin credentials. And those credentials will give him access to the identity store in Active Directory. Once you have Active Directory, once you have the ntds.dit Active Directory database, you can create sessions for anybody you want. You don't have to create a new user, but you could be anybody you want. And they don't go after Active Directory because Active Directory is all that interesting, but because it enables them to execute their attacker mission, whether that be steal data, destroy your systems, and then they want to persist in your network. That's a big part of it.
Yeah, I mean, with the exception of some of the recent ransomware activity where it seemed to be a very short-term operation focused on the one-time payday, most of the attacks that we see, and we do see several a week in most cases, most of the attacks we see, they do want to be in there for the long term, and frequently they have been there for quite a long time. And unfortunately, this is a silent attack. It's very difficult to detect, and it's something that we see a lot. We see a lot more than people think it's there. And I think we think it's really because it's because of that silence that people don't know that they're sharing control of their environment with the attacker, because the attacker doesn't want to be detected. They'd rather just silently accomplish their mission without being bothered by defenders trying to kick them out.
And that's a key point, because a lot of times a network doesn't have the protective controls that would serve as a detective control. So it's perfectly common for something like that lateral account movement you saw to be happening, and they have no idea where their credentials might be living, because there's a lot of places that they think they've got one or two attack tools blocked, and that's going to stop the problem. And these are highly resourced and motivated attackers. If you've got interesting data or you're interesting to them in some way, they're going to be able to do that first part there.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've actually published is about a 10-minute video that we put up on YouTube. The link is there, the Cred Theft demo link, and we highly encourage you to take a look at that and to understand a lot of the different nuances for the various different technical ways of how this attack specifically progresses. The one thing that we did want to emphasize that is a very common misconception is that people believe that run as protects against a credential theft or a pass the hash attack. It does not. It's something we see come up very frequently. And ultimately, a run as session on a Windows computer is just as vulnerable as a standard fully logged on session.
A lot of places they'll have a dedicated domain admin account, which is incredible. It's good that you've made that step in the right direction, but they're using them on the same workstation, and they're doing a run as to launch something like ADUC. And whether or not you're using NTLM or Kerberos or whatever technology in the environment, that means those credentials are harvestable by an attacker, and that's where a lot of places have had problems.
Yep. So in response to this, Microsoft has put together a roadmap, and we've put together a very specific ordered roadmap based on our learnings from the incident responses of what we think organizations should be doing first, next, and after that to protect against these attacks. Again, that same link, the Securing Privileged Access Roadmap link, all of this information is published out on TechNet. We encourage you to read it, follow it, implement it, because we want you to get protected against these attacks. So did you want to talk a little bit about the credential theft attacks?
Yeah, so credential theft, I mean, if you want to not have to type your password every single day on a system, regardless of platform, this is not just a Windows-specific problem, your credentials have to be stored in memory. And if an attacker has access of system-level privileges to dump the memory, they can extract those credentials there. So when we talk about credential theft or credential attacks, they're getting a credential. It might even be through keylogging. And then they're going to be able to utilize that other places because the credential is not locked down to specific systems. And this is incredibly common, depending on which incident response company you ask. It's anywhere between 74 to 99 to 100% of attacks they go to that this has happened at. So,
yeah, it's very frequent, and there's only a few exceptions in our investigations that we have firsthand knowledge of, where this technique is not used simply because it's easy, available, and it's effective. So the adversary has no reason not to use it. The defenses against it are really threefold. We divide it into preventing escalation, so preventing that line from going from the bottom to the top of the screen. We don't want the compromise of a workstation or server to lead to the compromise of a domain, and we don't even want the compromise of a workstation to lead to a server at a broad level. And those are fairly easy lines to draw in most cases. Most of the time, organizations only have teams that are dedicated to only workstations, only servers, or only identity systems. So we found that that works generally very well, and we've got some very specific recommendations around that. Lateral traversal, we want to stop that ability if you knock over one type of resources that you get every instance in that class. We don't want you to knock over an attacker to knock over one workstation, get all of them. And then that privilege usage visibility, being able to see what's going on and see anomalies and react to them is a critical aspect of protecting against that credential theft and abuse.
And when we think about a domain controller attack, you can actually attack a domain controller directly. There's a lot of attack surface for any type of system, but if we think about in particular, if you've got console level access to a domain controller, or if you're on, some sort of shared resource, or what are some of the other ways that you can get into a domain controller? If you haven't taken a look at your default domain controller policy recently, there's probably some people who aren't domain admins who have domain admin equivalent access. So we want to make sure that we harden and understand the configuration of those domain controllers, because the types of agents that you install onto a domain controller, depending on how maybe your backup or your antivirus even, it can lead to inroads to compromise in those domain controllers that we have seen used by attackers. So it's not just thinking about where those credentials are, but there may be direct ways to just simply get the copy of Active Directory.
Exactly. And the defenses around that, we really break into two different areas. We want to harden the configuration of those domain controllers, mostly through group policy, but there's a number of other configurations that you can make as you install and configure domain controllers. And then another very specific category of it is agent attack surface. And one of the things that many organizations don't realize is that every time you install an agent to manage a server, you have granted a system full control over that server and all of the things that it controls. And ultimately, that agent attack surface really extends who has control of the domain, who is effectively a domain admin or an enterprise admin, to all of those various management systems. So it's very critical to take away the ones that you don't want, to essentially prune those off of the tree.
And if we think about AD attacks itself, so Active Directory itself, it can actually have misconfigurations that can lead to attack. So there's systems inside of Active Directory, there's services inside of Active Directory that can have permissions on them that would allow an attacker to just instantly get full control in your domain. Or think about how you might connect workstation administrator to domain admin. And it turns out that if you don't have host firewalls on in your environment and you haven't stopped lateral account movement, an attacker could simply query who's in the local administrators group of all the systems on your network. So they would just be able to figure out and cherry pick which groups they would need to chain there. So think about those group policies of what permissions are out there. Maybe we've got a legacy policy linked to your domain controllers that's using a weak encryption algorithm on Kerberos. I know it's a little bit deep and hardcore nerd there, but that's the type of stuff that actually does lead to compromise as we think about the configuration of Active Directory, the group memberships in Active Directory. And that's the type of things where maybe you've got server operators for the team that does all of your work there. That's an incredibly broad privilege that gives them domain controller permissions as well.
And one of the other ones that we had at a particular instance, a particular active attack, was an organization that had done a very good job of protecting their domain admin credentials and preventing them from being exposed on systems. But they had inadvertently, and this had happened about 10 years before, they had left a permission on the admin SD holder, which of course is the permission that's applied to a lot of administrative objects in Active Directory. They had weakened the permission on that for the convenience and allowed a lower tier admin, a server level admin, to control all of the domain controllers effectively. And so what ended up happening was, after the attacker couldn't find the credentials to steal, they fell back and use that permission in Active Directory to gain permission to the whole Active Directory. And so this is something that the attackers do look for and do use, so you've got to make sure that that hygiene is there.
Yep. And we've been seeing that more and more because people have been taking advantage of learning about credential hygiene and things like that, and it's these legacy configurations. I've gone to many an incident where they no longer knew that they had that permission, but the attacker definitely did.
Yep.
So.
And the last piece is the attacker stealth. And very simply, the attacker doesn't want to be bothered. They want to accomplish their mission without being bothered by all these defenders trying to kick them out. And so the more that you can flush them out and expose them, the less time that they have to operate, the more time that they spend fighting you versus actually accomplishing their mission, which is likely to damage your organization. So the roadmap that we have here is broken into kind of a now, next, later. What we think you should be starting immediately, pretty much don't need a whole lot of planning, within a 2 to 4 week period. That's the first stage. The stuff that we think you can get done within 1 to 3 months, and the stuff that's going to take a little bit longer. It may take up to 6 months or longer. Now, some of these timelines may look a little bit optimistic, but we have seen organizations, especially those that have recently been compromised, accomplish these hardenings in
very, very quick time
in this time frame,
yes.
and better. And ultimately, provided resources and motivation, these are very, very easy to, I wouldn't say easy to accomplish, but these are very well within the reach.
The technical challenges are usually not the problem. It's usually more political challenges of changing administrative workflows.
Yes. Yep. So onward with the roadmap. So the first stage of the roadmap starts establishing this separate administrative channel. Many organizations have already gotten a separate admin account for admin tasks. Great, that's the first step, and you're already on your way. Simply having that separate account is the start. But ultimately, even though you have a separate account, if that same account is used on a lower trust workstation, anyone in control of that workstation can steal it. So you do need a separate, dedicated admin workstation. This could take the form of 2 separate pieces of hardware sitting next to each other. This could also take the form of a single trusted, secured admin VM that has a admin host that has a user virtual machine or VM hosted on it.
And it's really important to bring out why you said it in the order that you said it, because it's a trusted host with a user VM, because it's a lot easier for malware to break into a VM than out of a VM. So we want to make sure that the dangerous web browsing behavior is done inside of a VM. And that's where a lot of people, they have jump servers or they have VMs for admin work. And that's actually kind of the backwards approach, and attackers can quite easily take advantage of those.
Exactly. And the guidance on how to build one of these privileged access workstations is published at that URL there. And we highly encourage every organization, especially you that are watching this, please set up PAWS. Start with your domain admins. That is step 2 in the roadmap. Step 3, because of that lateral traversal, which usually uses those local accounts, it's very, very common practice for organizations to have the same admin password across all workstations and across all servers. This is an urgent vulnerability that needs to be addressed. The way to address it was with a free tool we call LAPS, and it sets up unique local admin passwords for each host. And excuse me, and it will register those unique passwords in Active Directory so that they can only be accessed by authorized admins. You can then delegate it out to whoever is appropriate to. And so we want you to apply these to both workstations and to servers so that you have unique local admin passwords on both the workstations and the servers. So if an adversary gets control of those, they do not have immediate access to the other assets that are configured similarly. And within 2 to 4 weeks, within about a month's time, you can get yourself in a position where most adversaries will be extremely frustrated when they get in your environment. If you have this set up with admin workstations for your domain admins, and you have unique local passwords on your workstations and servers, this will put up a lot of barriers for the adversary and will be, and it will not stop them, but it will slow them down significantly. It will also take some of their favorite tools out of their toolbox.
It's absolutely, yeah. It's not going to stop everything, but it will be an attack surface reduction, and it'll be some very big things. And every single one of these steps, the more that you do it, the more noise the attacker will have to do. So it's not only that they have to try harder to get into your environment, because if you're a very interesting environment, they're still going to keep trying. But it's also the fact that they might start to make more noise with what they're doing.
Exactly, and they'll be a lot easier to detect if they have to use noisier methods. And so, as we take a look at relative measurements, these are not based on objective numbers. These are subjective differences. But if you look at all these different things that we talked about, we focused the first month there, the first 2 to 4 weeks, on those top priority mitigations because these are the attack techniques that the adversary prefers, and most adversaries prefer and intend to try first. And this does include the emergent ransomware threat that we're seeing, is they are trying the same types of credential theft attacks as well. So as we move on to phase 2, we're going to build on that. So the next step is we're going to take those privilege access workstations and we're going to go ahead and start using those for our Tier 1 and Tier 2 administrators, for our server administrators and our workstation administrators, because we want to make sure that those admins have that same level of protection. It does take a little bit longer, we found, to get those out to there because there tends to be more administrators in there and they tend to need a few more administrative tools and applications that have to be integrated into the PAWS. So for that reason, we put that out into the 1 to 3 month time frame, and there's a few extra security features that you can also add on. Again, all of this is in that same documentation on how to build a PAW, and the phase 1 and phase 2 are all outlined there. Next step is time-bound privileges. For the admins that have all these privileges, the default is that admins that have privileges permanently all the time, and every time they use that account, they're exposed permanently. And if an adversary has that account, has access to that account, they have all of those privileges. And so on both on-premises as well as in Azure, we have capabilities that allow you to have time-bound privileges. For the on-premises world and also for cloud-based, there are also plenty of third-party alternates, some of which you may already have deployed. Great. If you already have that, skip this part of the roadmap and then go on to the next step. Those solutions are not a direct substitute for this roadmap. If you have a privilege access management or a privilege identity management solution, you are not automatically safe. You have to follow the rest of the steps of the roadmap, including this step, to have a good, solid security posture.
And so a lot of mistakes get made when people get either randomized local administrator passwords or they have the elevated access time boxed, and they don't do things like the rest of the lateral movement mitigations. There's group policies you have to set. You have to still use all of your PAW. So it's something where you need to start and you need to do parts of it, but it is really a big picture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so the follow-on step to that is when you introduce one of these solutions, whether it's a Microsoft or a third-party solution, almost all of them have multi-factor, and you can use multi-factor for elevation. And in absence of getting multi-factor out for all of your admins, which sometimes for on-premises worlds is difficult because you may have to stand up a PKI to get your smart cards working, or an infrastructure for another one-time password type of solution, or possibly even distribute devices. With the multi-factor for elevation, you can actually isolate the privileges and the privilege use and have multi-factor enforcement on that proof up as a proof up mechanism without having to necessarily deploy that full infrastructure, because you can do the cloud dialing out to a phone device or the like. So it's a nice shortcut to get multi-factor if you don't have it already. That's why we separated that out as a specific step there. Next step, just enough admin. So this is a technology that's built into PowerShell. Phenomenal technology. This allows you to get to least privilege access in a lot of ways that were not possible before. So this PowerShell feature allows you to expose only safe commandlets and aspects of PowerShell so that you can delegate those out to an admin and someone can actually do administration, in this case, in this scenario, of a domain controller, and they don't have full admin over the domain controller themselves. They can actually perform a number of safe tasks that an admin of that server would need to perform, but they don't have admin over it. They just simply have access to run these predetermined tasks. So it's a great way to get to least privilege and reduce your count of admins, which is a significant, usually a significant risk. And as far as reducing your admin count, that's one thing I wanted to add one quick comment on, is part of the PAW recommendations do include reducing your admin count, and that is part of the instructions and part of the guidance there. And it tends to happen naturally, because when you have to set up a PAW for each admin, you tend to think about who really does need admin. And so it's a good exercise to go through as you go through the PAW stuff as well. We find it naturally happens there.
Yeah, and there's some guidance I think we included in the PAW white paper for figuring out who needs admin. And there's other capabilities that we have that can show you where people are logging in, things like Windows Event Forwarding, that can help out with that reduction.
Yep, and there's some links to some recommended security standards that we think would be appropriate for organizations to adopt to their own environment as well. So there's quite a bit of guidance there at that CyberPAW link. The next piece here is just lowering the attack surface of the domain in DCs. And again, referring to Jessica's early comment on attack surface, it really is about lowering your organization's attack surface, and then specifically on the domain in DCs, there's a number of different areas through those XS agents that we manage, through that we mentioned earlier, through the XS service accounts. Service accounts really shouldn't be in domain admins for any reason. There are plenty of alternates that that work. So we haven't found any legitimate reason for a domain admin level service account. There's a number of different pieces. Again, guidance is there at that link on how to follow that and lower your attack surface down.
Because domain admin level service accounts are particularly scary because, as Mark said, if you're not making trusts, if you're not building new domain controllers with that account, it doesn't really need to be domain admin. And a lot of people use it as a delegation to give a local administrator on a wide swath of servers. But a key thing to remember about a service account, password never changes. And if it is in fact logging in as a service, that's logon type that presents credentials into memory on everything it does. So if you've got something like a systems management agent or an antivirus agent or maybe a scanning for vulnerability type thing that's running as domain admin, it's leaving credentials behind on everything and actually increasing your attack surface.
Yep, because it doesn't just give you credentials to the server you're adminning. It gives credentials to the whole domain. Least privilege. The last piece is attack detection. We've specifically called out ATA. There's a number of others, third parties on the market that do user entity behavior analytics, new acronym for me. But and that's only one category of the attack detections that are out there. Ultimately, you have to have a robust attack detection regime in place. You have to have the detections in place. You have to have the staff to see those alerts. You have to be able to investigate them, and you have to be able to respond and clean up to them. And so this is more of a placeholder than anything else. Ultimately, ATA or a similar capability is a critical part of these identity attacks that we see, which is why we highlighted it here. But you do have to have a robust attack detection regime in place. So when we take a look at the 1 to 3 month plan, the design really was intended to get you a broad swath of progress against each of these different areas. Once we had gotten over that initial attack, the initial attacker's preference of their favorite techniques, we wanted to then start having a nice broad investment across all these various pieces to really raise the attack surface in a bunch of areas, which is more likely to disrupt more attackers and more different attack styles. So as we move into the 6 month, and these are the longer term projects, and these do take more planning, these take more integration in the organization, and these are projects that take a little bit longer, and they will help get you into a much more proactive security posture that's starting to get ahead of the attacker techniques. Modernize the roles and delegation model. There's a tier model that's called out in the PAW guidance and the reference materials. It was also called out earlier in the slide deck in the presentation. And there's a set of rules around that tier model about who can log on to what types of workstations, to what types of servers, and taking those rules of control and applying those across your roles and who's delegated to what control of it, members of different groups, and applying those in there. That's a key task over the long term to make sure that you're not opening up a vulnerability through your delegation model or have opened one up in the past and aren't aware of it. And so reviewing your roles and delegation model and modernizing it is critical, but it does take some time. Next piece is the smart card or passport authentication for all admins, getting yourself to multi-factor for all of the authentications, not just the proof up to the privileges. So if you've already got this, great, check the box, move on to the next step. If you don't have multi-factor, we do strongly recommend it over the long term. It's easier to get it on a proof up operation within a privileged account management or a privileged identity management workflow. That's the easiest place to put it, but ideally you do want to have it before the account logs in. The next step is something that we frequently use, typically in a post-breach scenario after an organization has been compromised. This really builds on the PAWs that we put in for those domain admins, for their what we call tier 0 admins. The intent is if you have a forest that is of questionable integrity because it's been compromised possibly at one point, you may want to put in a forest that's known good, which is where the administration of the production forest goes in place. It's a very difficult, complex task, at least as far as the ESA reference architecture that we've built. It's something that's quite complicated as when it's fully implemented with IPsec and all the various pieces. We do have a pretty decent couple-page outline that we published on that to describe it. But it is a challenging task, and it is something that takes a long time to implement. But it does give you that extra assurance for an existing forest that you may not be able to clean up or replace. Next piece is the code integrity policy for domain controllers. This is really getting into the Windows Server 2016 technology. So in Windows Server 2016, many of the protections that were in place for that were introduced in Windows 10 have also been introduced in Server 2016 and enhanced in several ways, including the code integrity policies for the operating system and application code as well. And domain controllers are just a critical part of your system, and having that technology there to protect them from the hardware on up, and having that hardware-backed assurance for the operating system and the applications and the credentials is critical. And then one of the other things that we do see a lot is virtualized DCs. It's a very, very common practice. And there's also other sensitive workloads as well. One of the technologies that's included in Server 2016 Hyper-V is a technology called shielded VMs, or shielded virtual machines. And these machines are protected against the host that they are hosted on. So you can have a virtual DC that is accessible in all the normal ways that the domain controller would be accessible in all the authorized channels, but if it's hosted on a normal virtualization instance that's not shielded, the admins of that virtualization host, of the virtualization infrastructure, the virtualization management tools, all of them would have the ability to compromise that domain controller. With the shielded VMs, the shielded infrastructure is cut out because the disk is encrypted, and then there's protections to keep the host from being able to access the memory, and a number of other protections are put in place. But ultimately, those VMs are shielded from the host that they're actually running on. And so that would be for the virtual DC scenario. And again, these are all longer-term things that take a little while to plan to deploy. But ultimately, following this roadmap will take you to a state, and of course, you'll notice the green bars do not go all the way to the right. We are security people, and security people will never give you 100%. They give you the best protections that we know of today. These will give you a very proactive, protective posture. And just a note on the bottom there, we only covered a little bit of the detection world, just specifically the identity piece of it, and there is much more to it. That's why that one isn't complete. But ultimately, this is Microsoft's recommendation for how to protect yourselves against the attacks that we are seeing today. And just in closing here, ultimately, Microsoft, we are committed to protecting you. We've got a lot of assets and resources from technology and cloud intelligence and various different pieces, and we're bringing this power. We want to protect the assets that you have on premises and in the cloud, and we want you to leverage the security capabilities that you own.
Leveraging the security capabilities that you own is such a key point, because that's typically where we see that organizations have gone wrong, is they have made really good investments in security, but they haven't taken care to perhaps check out that Active Directory permissions we're talking about. So Active Directory is not just a security weakness or something that somebody's going to attack in your environment. It can actually be a very strong tool. And that's what a lot of what you've shown us today is actually about, utilizing the built-in capabilities that you have. Just talking about the preventing lateral movement, that's all group policy based. That's all something that you already own. And that's a really set of good news in this current environment, I think.
Absolutely. And it really, I mean, one of the things that we want to emphasize is that All of this here is meant for you to be able to follow on your own. We've set up a whole lot of documentation. We've open sourced a number of solutions that our cybersecurity teams have been delivering for a number of years because we want customers to be able to protect themselves. We want all of you guys to be able to protect yourselves against these attacks. And that's really the most important thing for us. And so that's something that we wanted to reinforce. And so as we close up, I wanted to reinforce that all of this is public on the Securing Privileged Access Roadmap link. Highly encourage you to go out, check it out on TechNet, read it, follow it, install it. And one more, we want you to provide feedback. If this is working for you, if it works great, we want to hear about it. If it's not working, if you're having trouble with it, we want to hear about it. If it's taking longer than you thought it might, or it could have been easier this way or that way, we want to hear about it. We're very interested in hearing your feedback. We want to improve it. We want to make sure that this is working and that you're able to protect yourself against it. And if you're able to stop an attack with it, we'd love to hear that news.
And we hope that you'll take these steps and be able to start to reduce the attack surface in your network right now. There's some things that you can do very quickly. There's a lot of really good stuff that we've released for free, and there's improvements that you can start to make today.
Yeah, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.